Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley. I listen to other podcasters regularly, Odd Atheist Friends, Left at the Valley, Sam Harris, Infinite Monkey Cage. You get the idea. I came across a Dogma Debate episode with a guest by the name of Dallas Duff. The conversation just kept getting stuck in the weeds, and they seemed to end further apart than when they started. I thought, we can do better. Today, I'm going to be talking to Dallas and trying to find some common ground on religion and politics, two things we're not supposed to be talking about. Let's see if this could be done.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
You know, it's the same thing with string theory or quantum physics, where we say, wow, this stuff is crazy. It seems like it's breaking all the laws. Well, guess what? Write a new textbook, asshole. Not calling you an asshole, but you know what I mean. Like, write a new textbook, asshole, because here we go. You gotta learn new rules. You gotta change things up. But the natural world is still the natural world. We can't test the supernatural, right? So if I were to pose to you the concept of methodological naturalism, is that something that you could get behind?
So I agree in at least 2/3 of what you just said. Like, I agree. Okay. I agree that methodological naturalism is probably the only way we can really know something and prove something.
What you just described is just basic xenophobia 101. It really is, man. And I'm not saying you're like some crazy right-wing Nazi guy. Like, I'm not doing that. You know, I'm not saying you're an alt-right nut. But we have to find some kind of middle ground, I think.
I've heard people try and argue that, like, the right has drifted further right, and like I think that's just totally wrong. Like, the over time, the right has actually drifted further left, or at least further to the center, and then the left is starting to drift like way too far left. Particularly, you know, the Democratic Party. That's the thing that I'm most worried about, is just getting so far left that we just totally destroy everything.
Well, I think we agree going either way too far isn't for the best of the people.
I'll say we can agree on that.
Yeah. I always like to just, whenever I start getting upset with a right-wing person, recognizing that, you know, I'm coming from the left naturally, because that's my values, right? We do have different values. And I always just try to remember, we're both in the damn cave.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
And today we're talking to Mr. Duff, Dallas Duff. Dallas the Duff. What's up, buddy?
I like to refer to you as the Duff.
The Duff. I'm trying to think of like a cool nickname for you, man, but the Duff sounds pretty cool. So you're an agnostic theist, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
That I got to tell you, to my listeners, they're so used to like fundamentalist Christians coming on for debates or whatnot. And as far as I understand, like, you're not really here for like a serious hardcore debate per se. You just want to have a discussion. You want to talk it out. You want to get down to the brass tacks. But I got to tell you, man, you being an agnostic theist is going to sound weird to a lot of people listening right now. Tell them and me what that means. Like, I mean, are you even like a Christian or what?
So I would say I have a certain admiration, I guess, for lack of a better word, for kind of the kind of Christian/biblical worldview. We can get into more of the details of that, but yeah, kind of agnostic theist. So I mean, just to break that down for those who find that slightly confusing. So, you know, agnostic just kind of refers to the fact that, you know, I don't claim to have all the answers. I don't claim to know God exists. So in that sense, I'm agnostic. And then obviously the theist is where I kind of lean in terms of kind of the belief area. So, you know, there's the knowing and then there's the believing. And that's this is one of those issues that I have one of the most difficult times with other religious people, because I relate to certain religious people and a lot of values and a lot of things. But then there's a lot of them that I talk to, they don't really understand the difference between kind of knowing and believing, or they conflate the two of them, or they think that because they believe something strongly, it means they know something. And so, I like to kind of think about things on a deeper level, and I go, okay, like, let's look at this in terms of, what we're actually saying, what we're actually doing. Because I don't think you're doing your worldview, your belief system justice when you claim to know something that I don't think is even knowable. Like, I think there's a certain arrogance to that. So I think it's important that people distinguish the difference between what they know and what they believe. But, this often goes in one ear and out the other with a lot of people. But, I do my best to try and hammer this message down.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important distinction. Because
it is.
So many people are like, man, I believe it so much that I know it. Like, I know it because I believe it. And it's frustrating because, let me say it this way. I appreciate that we don't have to waste time trying to figure out the difference between belief and knowledge. Like, sometimes I'll talk to somebody and I feel like this should have been a 3-hour convo. This should have been a 5-hour convo because it took us an hour just to get to this simple point. And I feel like we're already way ahead. So we're at a place where we can say, okay, epistemologically, belief and knowledge are different, but let's key in on that, man. Let's figure this out. You still believe in God, but you don't claim knowledge of him, which, once again, not to be redundant, but I appreciate that. But what makes you believe in God?
So, I mean, obviously, I think this is for me in particular, this is a very complex question that I've put a whole lot of thought into, and I've evolved on the question, and I'm sure I'll evolve into the future, on this question. I mean, I'm only 30 years old. Hopefully, I have a whole lot of life to lead at this point. So I'm sure my views will change. Maybe more in the theistic direction, maybe more back in the other direction. So just to give just a basic synopsis of kind of where I come from. So I did grow up in a Christian religious home. It wasn't like overbearing, but it's not like I was given a whole lot of other viewpoints as well. I grew up kind of in that type of household. And then as I got probably out of high school, I went to a Christian high school. As I got out of high school, I didn't go to a traditional college, so these views didn't necessarily come from college. These views came from more of kind of my own seeking and asking questions. So I started questioning a lot of kind of what I was taught growing up, and I started discovering a lot of these kind of public intellectual atheist types. Everyone from your Richard Dawkins types to Sam Harris to Matt Dillahunty, etc.
Right.
And a lot of them had some really good points and brought up some really good questions. So I got really deep into consuming as much as I could from those guys, because I already had spent 18 years at this point, pretty much just only being fed a lot of the kind of Christian narratives, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it was good to hear some of the some perspective from those who thought differently. And then, now fast forward to the last 3 years of my life at this point. I would say I've discovered some more people more on the theistic side, both. Some being Christian, some being Jews, some being, even not specifically anything, just kind of, from a scholarly perspective. And I've started to come around back toward a little bit more. I'm hearing more of just kind of the general arguments for, why the whole idea of God isn't a completely irrational thing. Because here's what I got just in a nutshell. You get you get kind of in this Christian bubble, and then you hear, atheists are stupid. They believe, and they give you some straw man version of that, and then you kind of find a bunch of atheists, and then they go, oh, Christians are so stupid, like they believe this, and then they present a straw man version of that, and so everyone's just kind of straw manning each other. And so it's hard to kind of get outside of that. And so as I've kind of tried to hear the best arguments from each side, I think the atheists are good in certain things, and I agree with in certain areas. But where I think it falls apart for me is more in kind of the kind of the lack of there's kind of a lack of logical explanation for kind of a naturalistic worldview. So, for example, what I'm talking about when I say kind of the naturalistic worldview. So, most atheists are also naturalists, which just means that they don't believe in any type of supernatural. They believe in everything that is natural. So, for me, as I've started to ask deeper questions about how did the complexity of not just us, but kind of just the systems of the universe that work in a very functional way. The laws of the universe. How is there even a logical explanation for that if there's no dictation of anything? If it's just all came from nothingness and chaos. I can't come to a logical explanation for that, and then people on the other side will argue, oh, well, you can't logically explain God. And they would be right. I can't technically logically explain, where God came. Well, first off, the whole idea of God is that he didn't have to come from anywhere. Like, the divide. Okay. In my opinion, here's where the divide between, thinking atheist and thinking theist kind of come from, and I think it kind of boils down to atheists in the hierarchy of values. I think atheists value empiricism as like the highest value for like most atheists, but most theists empiricism isn't their highest value. I think there are other things that they value, including like kind of other kind of logical issues and questions. I think it's kind of empiricism versus logic, and I'm not saying atheists are like fundamentally illogical, but I think that's where the hierarchy of values stacks. If you take a thinking person who's an atheist and a thinking person who's a theist, I think it's not that one's dumb and one's smart. It's just their hierarchy of values stacks up differently, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. So it sounds kind of like the fine-tuning argument still has you. Like this, it's still got its hook in you. Like you were able to blow off all the everybody goes to hell if they don't believe in the right God kind of stuff, or you get 72 virgins if you believe in Allah, or Joseph Smith read gold tablets inside of his hat. Like all that, like you're like, get out of here with that noise. I'm not trying to hear it. But that fine-tuning argument, that whole like, where did it all come from? How does it all work together so well if somebody didn't design it? It sounds like that one really hit you hard.
Yeah, and it's not even the how as much as it is the why. It's like which is more of a philosophical question.
Why
like,
are we here? Yeah.
Yeah, like why would the whole the whole concept of planetary orbits functioning in a very predictable pattern, why would that happen in a purely naturalistic world where everything starts from essentially nothing and there's no order? Like why would that occur? And I do find kind of the those kind of logical arguments against kind of the purely naturalistic worldview, I do find them somewhat compelling. Yes.
Let me throw this at you. All right. Douglas Adams, I'm sure you heard of him. He said this: imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, this is an interesting world I find myself in. An interesting hole I find myself in. Fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well. Must have been made to have me in it. This is such a powerful idea that as the sun rises in the sky and the air heats up, and as gradually the puddle gets smaller and smaller, it's still frantically hanging on to the notion that everything's going to be all right, because this world was meant to have him in it. So the moment he disappears catches him rather by surprise. I think this may be something we need to be on the watch out for. So that's Douglas Adams. He's kind of using the old puddle analogy, which you've probably heard of before, but it's saying like the puddle is shaped exactly like the hole it fits in, and it thinks, wow, this was made for me. Everything works out perfectly. It holds me all together. Where the crack, in the street that the puddle is built up in from the recent rain, that's exactly where I fit into, where it's like a big kind of bowl-like shape that fits perfectly for my bowl-like water shape of a puddle. That puddle looks at his surroundings, and he doesn't really recognize that he simply just evolved, to coin the phrase, into the surroundings that would best fit him, right? He is a product of his environment rather than his environment being a product made specifically for him. And I wonder sometimes whenever somebody looks at the world and goes, how else could all this work together, and why? Why is it here? Why are we here? And I kind of go, you're talking puddle talk a little bit. Like, it's not like a bad question. I'm not criticizing the question. Why are we here is a beautiful question. I'm just saying, whenever you come to somewhat of a belief of maybe it was designed, I start to wonder, like, well, how could you ever prove that? It's just a feeling.
A couple thoughts on that. So one is that we can explain puddles and holes and mud and whatever else it might relate to this analogy. We can absolutely explain, whereas what I'm kind of bringing up is there's much less of an actual explanation. And part of what you said too reminded me of my previous point that I made about kind of how, as a general observation, atheists seem to hold empiricism as their highest value. So I think this may be one of those issues, one of those examples to where you're holding empiricism to a higher value than I am, because I don't, because I'm with you on the question of how can we know that, that there's if there is or isn't any purpose, or if there is or any God. We agree kind of on that question and where we come out to, where on the other end of that question is obviously I don't know, for I think anyone who's being honest. But you hold empiricism to a higher value than I do, and I don't think that's necessarily right or wrong. I think that's just the hierarchy of values to where we find ourselves.
What else do you ascribe to aside from empiricism? Not saying that empiricism is the only thing. I'm just wondering, like, when you say, it seems like, Robert, you're really putting that empirical thinking on a high shelf. And I'm saying, well, what would you propose to put on the shelf, or what else maybe? What other items?
Yeah, well, there's I think there's also kind of the deeper philosophical questions, and this is where people, if they want to, can go back and listen to my conversation on the Dogma Debate podcast, and I kind of went through this a little bit. But I think from my observation, most atheists ignore some of the deeper philosophical questions. And they're just so dead focused on kind of the empiricism. What can we prove? That they really ignore like the deeper philosophical questions. So I think empiricism is an important thing to look at, but I think some of the deeper philosophical questions are also important to look at. And like my conversation with David Smalley, he didn't really want to talk about the deeper philosophical questions because he was so he didn't think it was important, whereas I did, and he was kind of wanting to move on in that conversation. Now maybe you and I, maybe we could go dive deeper into kind of those philosophical, those deeper questions.
Sure,
I don't know.
Sure. You kind of felt like he had kind of an agenda to keep things a little bit myopic in the atheist realm, maybe.
Right.
Well, I did hear you on Dogma Debate. I thought you did a great job, and that's why I contacted you. I say, man, that's exactly what my listeners are looking for. Is they're wanting just honest, real, heartfelt conversations about the tough stuff. Give me an example of something that is not so just basic, there is no God kind of thinking, but something that you would say is a deeper philosophical conversation that kind of leads you to be an agnostic theist.
So I think the problem of infinite regression is a big problem for the naturalist worldview, because pretty much everything. Now I could be wrong on this, but to my understanding, pretty much everything that we know exists in the material realm requires something else material in order for it to exist.
Right. Yeah, that one drives me crazy too, man. I'll be honest. Most of my listeners are pretty philosophy savvy, so they probably know. But but maybe somebody's listening and they're like, what the fuck are they talking about? But it's basically just that you keep moving the goalpost almost. Like you say, okay, so the tree is here because it came from the seed. You say, well, yeah, okay, where'd the seed come from? Well, the seed came from another tree. Right. Got it. Fine. I'm saying, where'd the tree come from? Like, really a seed. Right, but where'd that seed really come from? Well, really, a tree is like, stop, guys, it's annoying. But it's also, there's kind of like a logical problem with it. But I feel like where I end up on the infinite regress topic is that it's not physically illogical. It's just not a good way to make an argument. So if I were to say a logical fallacy, that doesn't necessarily prove my argument false, even though the word fallacy's in it. It shows that my argument didn't prove what I was trying to say, right? But it doesn't mean that what I was trying to say is wrong. I could make a logical fallacy about a true statement. And I feel like whenever it comes to infinite regress, it's a bad way to prove an argument, but that doesn't mean that infinite regress is wrong.
Yeah, like I think that, like it doesn't prove anything. Like, okay, there are people from the theistic perspective that try to present their arguments as a proof, like they do these gotcha things that I'm gonna prove to you that God exists in 5 questions. Like, you ready? Yeah. I don't do that, and I think that's not a good way to go about any type of conversation. And it's mostly people trying to manipulate other people. I don't think that's an honest way to approach the conversation. So I don't think that my view of the infinite regression, I don't think it's a proof that God exists, but I think it's definitely a problem for the naturalistic worldview. And that's really probably as far as I would be willing to go. Like, it's a problem that's hard to solve. Yeah, it's hard to solve it logically, and it's definitely hard to solve it like naturalistically. Like in my view, as I've kind of thought through this, really the only way to solve the problem, assuming we both agree that it is a problem, the only way to solve the problem is by inserting something supernatural at the very beginning that exceeds the natural, that doesn't require require something else in order for it to have been created, right?
But like, Dallas, doesn't that drive you crazy? Just what you just said. As an agnostic, like you're a sharp guy. I can pick up just from the way you're talking. So it kind of surprised me because I'm like, dude, what you just said just made me cringe. Whenever to say something like, to solve the problem, we insert a supernatural blank, 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 whatever. Immediately I'm like, whoa, that's not how it works. We can't do that. Like, you're breaking all the rules. You can't just your ambition to solve the problem cannot be mitigated by just throwing supernatural at it.
Do you and I, do we both agree? Because maybe we even disagree that it's a problem in the first place. Like, do we agree that logically and empirically that it is a problem, the whole infinite regression issue? Like, how do we go back? We agree that that's a problem,
100%. But just to clarify, I don't think that means that it's false. It could still be true. It just doesn't really add up. So I would agree with you with the term that it's a problem. Absolutely.
All right. So then it seems that, and I don't know if you're in this camp, but there are probably some people that would maybe say that, yes, it's a problem, but maybe it's also a problem that's also the answer. Like, it's like maybe it's, even though we can't conceptualize it, maybe there is, some regression of natural causes and effects that can literally extend backwards into infinity. I don't know too many people who would like just come out and say, yeah, that is what I think. But at the end of the day, it seems like that's the only that's the divide between whether you kind of hold a kind of naturalistic worldview or whether you kind of hold kind of a more a supernatural worldview.
Let me throw out one thing, okay? I gave you I agree with you 100% that it's a problem, all right? So I'm listening to you. I'm hearing you, man. But I want to throw like a little caveat here, okay?
Sure.
You keep referring to naturalism as if it's a thing rather than a spectrum of things. And part of the spectrum, it might be easier to break down into a dichotomy and say that There's philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is dogmatic. It's a lot like that Christian faith that you and I both left, right? Where, it's like, whoa, you're telling me that just because Noah's Ark had all the animals in it, that kangaroos must have somehow hopped all their way to Australia, like your dogma is so ridiculous, And to me, I feel like philosophical naturalism is kind of saying like, well, there's no supernatural. It can't exist. It just can't. And I don't really ascribe to that camp per se. I don't think either of us do. Because you can't say that. It's almost like saying, well, there is no God. Well, prove it. Well, there is no supernatural. Well, how are you going to prove there's no supernatural? Well, there's no supernatural. I don't see one. I don't see a ghost. But that's not really a great argument. A lot of people didn't see a black swan for a long time before they found a black swan, right? So where I kind of fall is more with methodological naturalism, which says the only things that we can actually test and measure in this world are natural things. So I'm going to use the method of naturalism to try to understand my universe. Now, if you show me something supernatural, guess what's going to happen within 30 seconds? The internet's going to blow up because I'm going to post that shit. You better believe it. I want the likes, baby. And then everybody's going to start talking about it. And then science is going to get involved. And they're going to start writing peer-reviewed journals on it. It's going to blah, 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 blah. It's going to start going crazy. And guess what happens? Oh, that was natural too. Happens all the time. Either it gets disproven or we actually figure out how it works. And that's kind of what gravity is. That's kind of what the whole system of the universe, the planets revolving around the sun, dark matter, dark energy, black holes. It's always like whenever the first time you hear about something crazy like that, you're like, oh shit, that's some supernatural stuff. Now, once we studied it, it's natural and it still has laws that it has to abide by. It's the same thing with string theory. Or quantum physics, where we say, wow, this stuff is crazy. It seems like it's breaking all the laws. Well, oh, guess what? Write a new textbook, asshole. Not calling you an asshole, but you know what I mean. Like,
right.
write a new textbook, asshole, because here we go. You gotta learn new rules. You gotta change things up. But the natural world is still the natural world. We can't test the supernatural, right? So if I were to pose to you the concept of methodological naturalism, is that something that you could get behind?
So I agree in at least 2/3 of what you just said. Like, I agree. Okay. I agree that methodological naturalism is probably the only way we can really know something and prove something, and it's the only way we, as fallible human beings, probably will ever be able to test and know any kind of truth on this earth. Where we disagree, I think, is more along the lines of kind of where our kind of value hierarchies stack up. That's really, we don't disagree on the premise. I think we just come down on different camps, because at the end of the day, neither one of, you don't believe in God, I believe in God. I can't, I'm not claiming to prove God exists. You're not claiming to prove God doesn't exist. But at the end of the day, we come down on different camps. And I think, the part of this conversation, I think, is really kind of shedding light on kind of why we come down on different camps. Right. I think, like, this conversation, I think, is good because it's probably not going to convince either one of us to change camps. But I think this is good to kind of clarify kind of why we are in the camps that we are in. Because I believe empiricism only goes so far. And then there are certain questions that can't be empirically known. So then the question becomes, okay, on those questions, what am I willing to take a position on some of these questions that extend beyond that which can be known empirically? And most people are dishonest when they say that they're unwilling to kind of take a position on things, because they really do take a position on things. And one thing that drives me crazy with certain conversations with certain atheists is, like, they claim like the theist is the only one that claims belief over X, Y, or Z. Like, we have both camps pick a side. Like, both camps pick a belief, and there's a spectrum of beliefs, right? Like, I'm not as far so far on the spectrum of theism that I claim to know God exists, or I claim to talk to God, or any of that kind of stuff. And you're probably not so far on the other end that you claim to know God doesn't exist, and that anyone who does believe he exists is just an idiot. Like I think those are the two extremes, right? Then there's a whole spectrum kind of in between, and then there's a whole bunch of questions that can't be known at all through any empirical testing or what have you. And I think, these are where kind of the real interesting questions lie, and where the kind of these types of conversations are most useful. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, like almost like a bell curve, except where the bell curve would almost be a spike, where the people that can actually not just yell at each other and say, "You're a fucking Nazi," or, whatever, or you're a libtard or whatever, like that.
Right.
The people that actually don't do that are at the top of that bell, but it's such a spike because there's so many people on either side. It's such a controversial time right now, whether we're talking about religion or politics or whatever. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's refreshing. One thing that you said that kind of rung my bell mentally, right, is you said maybe it's not so much about empiricism, Robert. Maybe it's about values. We can't know everything empirically, which I would agree with you, right?
Right.
Like knowing something a priori is not necessarily empirical knowledge, but it's still knowledge. So if I say a bachelor isn't married, well, you don't have to meet a bachelor and go through all his paperwork to see if he has a marriage license in his desk drawer. You just know he's not married a priori. And that's a perfect example of something like you don't have to have empirical evidence for everything. We believe stuff and we know stuff based on other reasons. I feel like the way that you're reasoning your belief might be a value system. It's almost like you're saying, I kind of want to believe it. Like I see the values of Christian doctrine, and I see the benefits to Western civilization that has come from that. So therefore, I want to believe in some kind of a God that's similar to Anglo-Saxon Christ-like teaching. Am I feeling you out right? Am I getting the right Dallas Duff here?
Yeah, I mean, and we haven't even really hit hard on like the values part. I think part of this I think you're inferring from probably what you heard me say some of on David Smalley's podcast. But yes, there's definitely a connection between kind of the values thing and the religious thing. But yeah, like there's for me it's two things. It's if I could just break it down into two specific words, it would be kind of logic and values. Like empiricism and logic are two different things. I know people conflate them, and I value empiricism to a certain extent, and to that which we can know empirically, I value empiricism extremely highly. But to that which can't be known empirically, I value logic. And then there's the values issues, which yes, like as I've started to reassess my views in the last couple years, my biggest concern is with kind of the direction society is headed. And so there are certain, this is where we can get into the political too, if you want to. Yeah. So as I've seen society move in a certain direction, and I have no idea where your politics stand, so this could be getting to an interesting area.
I'm pretty far left, man. I'm pretty far left.
Yeah, like I don't think a lot of what's going on is a real positive thing in terms of kind of where things are headed, and we can get into specifics about that. But I think there's definitely a connection between the decline in kind of Judeo-Christian values and then kind of the rise in other things. I'll give a specific example, not even necessarily related to the United States, but I'll give you kind of some thoughts on some things, and then I want to get your comments on it. But so here's what I see happening in a lot of places in Europe right now. So Europe is becoming more and more. They're becoming more and more atheists and less Judeo-Christian. And so oftentimes what happens is as people become more atheists, they also become more left. And as they become more left, they become in certain ways, more tolerant, which I think is debatable whether that's true or not. but for the sake of the argument, they become more tolerant in a certain way. So they want to be compassionate. They want to open up their society to all sorts of people. They want to allow the opportunities that they have for people to come into their society. So what we're seeing happen in Europe now is because of the decline in kind of the Judeo-Christian kind of worldview and a rise in kind of the more atheistic worldview. What's happening is they're letting in a lot of people who don't agree with their values, like so a lot of the Muslim world. And I don't want to get too much into like hammering down on the Muslim, like I don't get called like I'm Islamophobic, whatever. Like I'm not. Like I want to make it clear that there are good Muslims in this world. Like I'm just want to make that statement perfectly clear. But as a general rule, kind of the value system of Muslims as a whole is not necessarily perfectly in alignment with a lot of these secular people in Europe. But for whatever reason, there's this kind of lack of wisdom that seems to exist in kind of the leftist atheist world, where they think they can just let all these people in that are that don't hold their values, and that somehow they're just going to kind of they're just going to adopt the values of kind of the secular world. And I don't think that's what's likely to happen. I think what's likely to happen is that kind of as the Muslim population is going to grow and grow. And I think here's the reason why I think that's going to grow for two reasons. Like, one is religious people, whether Muslim, Christian, or whatever, they have more children. Like they have a lot more children, actually, Muslims in particular. So what's going to happen is they let all these people in that don't necessarily hold their values. They start breeding, and they basically are likely to get to a point in the near future to where those values, they're going to vote their values. And then what's going to happen is those secular atheist values are going to become minorities in the culture. And then they're going to think that they made a big mistake. But at that point, it's going to be too late.
Yeah, I agree with you that being too left can be dangerous. Just like being too right can be dangerous. If you're
sure.
If you're you got so much love in your heart that every single animal in the world is your best friend, you pick up a snake and it bites you. Well, you were a dumbass, right? But
right.
And it's very value based, because you're like, but I just love everything, and I get you 100%. The problem is what you just described is just basic xenophobia 101. It really is, man. And I'm not saying you're like some crazy right-wing Nazi guy. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm not saying you're an alt-right nut. But we have to find some kind of middle ground, I think. I don't see the correlation between atheism and liberalism per se. I see more like atheism really boomed right around the information age, right? People started getting more data, and they're like, oh, there's contradictions in the Bible. A lot stuff I wouldn't bore you with, because you could probably tell me as many as I could tell you. Like, you're up on all that jazz. But that boomed right around the information age, but that wasn't necessarily a liberalism boom. The liberalism boom seemed to occur, like it always does historically, right after a major war. It happens all the time. It happened right after World War II. Liberalism went all crazy for a while. And that's kind of what we're seeing now, is right after the Iraq War, which totally affects Europe and the United States, is a product of that is people are like, whoa, why are we going over there bombing people? I don't want that. Liberalism's really not for that kind of thing, right? Conservatism more leans toward the idea of we need to protect stuff. The best defense is a good offense. You know what I mean? Liberalism is a little less like, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to go kill brown people kind of feeling, but it also, in a very real sense, caused a refugee crisis. It caused it. It absolutely 100% caused it. So now we're dealing with the consequences of our action as Western civilization. So I would say that's what we're talking about, is not necessarily atheism leading to liberalism, leading to Muslims infiltrating our countries, and then they're going to start controlling your speech, and then, they take over and everybody becomes Muslim. That's just a lot of fear-based rhetoric, man. I think what we're dealing with is just the natural result of going and being at war in 7 different countries, man.
So kind of back to my point to what I was saying a minute ago, like it's a basic cause and effect thing, and I may be wrong about the cause and the effect, and I'm perfectly willing to hear counter arguments, but and there's also statistical links that we can see now, and that's even separate from cause and effect. So whether atheism causes someone to be more kind of left leaning on the political spectrum, maybe that's a little bit, maybe there's a little fuzziness there in terms of that. But I think it's pretty clear that statistically that if you are atheist, you're more likely to have more left leaning politics. I think would we agree on that point? At least?
Okay, yeah. I can agree with, even from my personal experience, I would say right after I gave up God, I also gave up my conservative leanings. Like I was a total, man, I voted for Romney. I voted for, who was the guy that ran against Obama the first term?
McCain?
Yeah, I voted for Romney. I voted for McCain. I voted for Bush in his second term. That goes about as far back as I can with my age. But still, like, it was a major shift for me toward liberalism. I'll give you that 100%. But my rebuttal to you wasn't so much about whether or not atheists lean more liberal or religious people lean more conservative. I grant that. My rebuttal to you was more in terms of this is what's causing issues in Europe with immigration.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, what are you saying is the main cause of issues of migration and immigration?
Is that we just came out of the Iraq War, and that we're continually destabilizing governments all throughout the Middle East, including Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq. That's the obvious result, and that this happens historically after any war. People tend to become a little bit more liberal thereafter. They become a little bit more conservative just before it, but afterwards they kind of start going, "Woo, let's back off." It's an ebb and flow. It's a natural political ebb and flow of all of Western democracy. It doesn't just have to be Republican conservative. Throughout Europe, where they have not just the two-party system, but they still have a dichotomy between liberal and conservative. People tend to get a little bit more liberal after we blow a lot of shit up. It's natural. But my only rebuttal on that was just that historically this is normal, and we're going to see this for a while until the wars start to subside, and then things will get a little more conservative again, and then we'll start blowing shit up again. But I was saying we should break that apart from the conversation about atheism. But in the conversation about atheism, I do agree with you. Atheists do tend to be a little more liberal. So I'll grant that, sure.
Right. Yeah, and the only reason I brought that up, and this is something that in these types of conversations I don't hear that much, which is one of the reasons I bring it up. Like, I think people need to be aware of kind of the likely consequences, whether positive or negative, of any change in their life. And it's not that if you become an atheist, you will become more left, or there are plenty of, I shouldn't have to say this, but just for the sake of it, so I feel good that I said it. There are plenty of conservatives who are atheists. There are plenty of people who are more left leaning, who are religious. But I think I do think there are consequences to certain things, and not even necessarily I want people to go like as conservative as I am. I just think I think people need to be aware of kind of certain causes and effect. And I think, people should be aware that, one of the consequences of being maybe, more open, there might be some negative consequences, particularly as a society, of being too open, and I think there is where you and I can agree is I think, probably too far right is bad and too far left is bad. Hopefully we can agree on that. So there's some tension, in the middle. And I think, that it is good to have some pushback to go, oh, wait a minute, it's good to be open, but and it's fine to be an atheist, but let's make sure that you're not letting A too much affect B, or let B too much become a negative consequence of C. So I think I just want to bring to light some of these things, some of these issues. I don't want I'm not trying to tell all atheists they need to be religious or theist or whatever, just to be aware of certain things that that may be influencing them, and to not maybe go too far into the extreme. And I can say the same thing about religious people too. There are people who become religious who just go way too far into like the extreme of certain things. And I think there's always kind of a rational middle ground to be found, whether you're religious or whether you're not religious. So, anyways.
No, I agree 100%. It's weird. It really does look like a horseshoe sometimes, where it starts to come back together. You're in the center and you start moving to the right, or and then another guy starts moving to the left, and the farther left and right you go, you start coming right back. And I don't think that it's necessarily that you come back toward the center, like the analogy of the horseshoe. I think it's that you end up both becoming a little more authoritarian.
Right. Yeah.
I remember that was something that Jordan Peterson, was it a monk debate? I think it was a monk debate where he had said, look, we've already established the problem with the right is that if you go too far right, you can become a crazy, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but you can become, really racist, KKK, Nazi, authoritarian nut job, And he said, he asked the question, what happens if you go too far left? Can you guys explain that to me? What is too far left? And there was no response to that from the other side of the debate. But I think it's the same answer. It's too authoritarian. If I go so far left that I want to restrict your speech because I'm afraid your speech is going to be a lot like that Mein Kampf speech, I don't want you to start talking because, hey, guess what? People listen to Hitler too, pal. So we better start shutting down the whole marketplace of ideas. We better start getting these bad talkers, this bad speech, negative thinking, thought crime, that sort of thing. We better get that out of here, out of the common square, as it were. That's just as authoritarian as saying we better get people that look different out of here. So I would agree with you there. We need to reject xenophobia from the right, racism from the right, bigotry from the right, trying to control people. But at the same time, we need to be careful because on the left, we can try to control ideas on that end too. It's not necessarily centrism that we need to focus on. It's more like liberty. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm big. While I wouldn't necessarily call myself a libertarian, I used to call myself a libertarian. I call myself more actually, I like the term conservatarian because I think it's kind of the best of both worlds, because I think where the values of where libertarians have it right is they're basically they don't trust authority, given the government hardly any power and authority. And I think for the most part, they're right about that. And I think conservatives, they have a focus on kind of the certain values and certain institutions, like, the value of churches in society, and then in certain ways, and the value of just kind of community. But anyways, like there are things there that I think need to be married together. And I think liberals too, like so you said you've used the word liberal a couple of times, like, and I always like to distinguish like liberal from leftist, because I think liberals actually hold more values in common with conservatives than people that I would consider leftists, which I would consider more on kind of the far left end of the spectrum. I think liberals are more centrist. They're center. Liberals are basically center left, and conservatives are basically center right. And I don't even know exactly where to place libertarians on there. They're probably a little bit even more right than conservatives, because they have a few more extreme ideas.
In some ways,
yeah, like
not socially, but yeah, in some ways, I guess.
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how those ideas are applied. Like, I think conservatives have a lot of things right, in terms of like social values. But where I think some of them get it wrong is when they want to apply those values from a top-down perspective in terms of, enforcing those values. And not all conservatives, to these modern-day conservatives, are kind of more libertarian-leaning conservatives. I think a lot of kind of the younger, more popular conservatives, like most of us, I consider myself a conservative. Like most of us don't really care that much about like, gay marriage either way. Like, most of us are like, it's fine, whatever. Like, do what you want as long as you're not, as long as you're not hurting anybody else directly. Some very libertarian on, those certain types of issues. But yeah, like you brought up Jordan Peterson, I think where he makes a really great point, and I've heard him make it several times, that there is value in both the left and the right to a certain extent, like, because the right is obviously about, kind of maintaining like certain kind of structures and values in society, and the left is about being open. And so you don't want to be, have such a strong hold on values that you want to control things, but you don't want to be so open that, that you become, too open to, bad ideas and open up your society to, all sorts of, negative things. So, there's definitely, there's somewhere in the middle there that hopefully we can find. And, I am worried right now that the sides are becoming way too polarized. I would argue that, that's the left has drifted. I've heard people try and argue that like the right has drifted further right. And like, I think that's just totally wrong. Like the over time, the right has actually drifted further left, or at least further to the center, and then the left is starting to drift like way too far left, particularly the Democratic Party. That's the thing that I'm most worried about, is just getting so far left that we just totally destroy everything.
Well, I think we'd agree going either way too far isn't for the best of the people.
I'll say we can agree on that.
Yeah. I always like to just, whenever I start getting upset with a right-wing person, recognizing that, I'm coming from the left naturally, because that's my values, right? We do have different values. And I always just try to remember we're both in the damn cave. And you're saying, let's stay in the cave. And I'm saying, let's explore outside of the cave. And if we're running low on food, sometimes that left-wing guy is the guy we need to listen to. But if there's a predator outside, we probably should be listening to that right-wing guy. So I think that's the whole point. Debate, conversation, getting together, talking it out, going through it issue by issue, not picking teams, not being, oh, I'm Trump, or oh, I'm Hillary, or whatever. No, let's talk it out. Let's figure out what's going on. Let's not be tribalistic. And before this conversation, I remember you saying, Robert, we're probably going to agree on more than we disagree, and you proved that to be 100% correct. Dallas Duff, I really appreciate talking to you today, man. And I think in the end, we found a lot of common ground, even though we might not have the same beliefs. So thank you so much for coming here and talking to us.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
I want to thank Dallas for talking to us today. Thank you to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to our patrons. You too can support us at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. So the goal of this episode was to have a respectful discussion with someone from a different religious or political worldview. But why do we have these different worldviews at all? What makes us liberal or conservative in the first place? Next week, we're going to find out. Dr. Hector Garcia, author of Alpha God, just dropped a second book, and oh my God, it is badass. Sex, Power, and Partisanship, How Evolutionary Science Makes Sense of Our Political Divide. Michael Shermer said this about it: an illuminating work of science and politics, the timing of which could not be more vital as our country is coming apart over seemingly intractable controversies. A must-read if you care about our future. That's going to answer a lot of our questions, and that's going to be next week. Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason.
There was a point on my appearance on the Dogma Debate podcast where me and David, we got caught up for like a half an hour, maybe not that long, but we got caught up on, whether or not atheists start with the belief. And, I made the point that I think that it's kind of a distinction without a difference on whether or not, like, like there's atheists start from the point of belief. And for full context, like I said, everyone can go listen to this. But here's really the point that I want to make. And this is really how I should have framed that to begin with, and maybe that would have helped in that conversation. But I've seen this type of divide where people are kind of talking over each other's heads, the atheists and the theists, on this particular issue. And I think here's where I think the conversation really kind of boils down to. We can really get it down to brass tacks. Like, so in the realm of reality, so that means that, the options that exist within reality, there's really only two options. Either God does exist, or gods, you could say, but any type of God exists or doesn't exist.
Right.
If there's a third option, I'm unaware of it. So those are the only two options that exist. So then at the end of the day, everyone comes down on one side of that or the other. Now, like I said earlier, there is a bit of a spectrum that does exist. Like, some people are really, really convinced that God exists. Some people are really, really convinced that God doesn't exist, and everything in between. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about a binary choice. Either you kind of have the general perspective that God does exist, you kind of fall on that side, or you have the general perspective that God doesn't exist. And I think it gets really silly when atheists and theists get bogged down in these like semantics of like, oh, well, you believe yours is a positive belief and mine is a negative belief. And I'm just like, oh, I just want to bang my head against the wall. I'm like, we're just totally getting bogged down in minutia. To close on my point, I'll use an analogy, because I like analogies. So let's say you're a kid and your mom tells you, you have to go to summer camp, and the only two summer camps that exist in your town are atheist camp and theist camp. And then another kid's mom tells him the same thing. You only have two choices. You can either go to theist camp or atheist camp. Now, maybe one of those kids chooses theist camp, one of those kids chooses atheist camp. And now maybe the kid that chooses theist camp is like really into it, right? Like he's like he's like swinging on the tire swing, and he's like swimming, he's riding horses,
Right,
whatever
right.
it is that the camp provides. He's like all in. And then meanwhile, you have, so-and-so over at atheist camp, and he's not as much like into it. Like, he's kind of like, like just kind of hanging in his bunk or whatever. Kind of like, maybe I don't really want to be here. At the end of the day, one kid's at theist camp and one kid is at atheist camp. And I think when we start framing these debates and like all these like just silly ways, like I said, like I don't think it really does. It does much to further the conversation. Let's just agree that I'm in one camp, you're in the other camp, and then let's just talk about why I can talk about why I'm in my camp and you're in your camp. So
Yeah, Ozymandias Ramses came on, and he made a very similar argument where he was saying atheists kind of have an equal burden of proof, more or less. And I know that's not necessarily where you're going with that, but his thing was that atheists believe there is no God. Theists believe there is a God. Where I see some correlation there between what you're saying and what he was saying is that you both seem to kind of agree that playing these semantic games of, positive or negative belief are kind of insignificant. I don't know that they are, though. That's my problem, is while they're annoying, like they're not fun, but I don't know that means like, I don't think like figuring out asymptotes and algebra is fun, but it's a concept you kind of got to know if you're going to do algebra, right? So if you're going to talk about belief and epistemology and theology, you kind of got to break down the stuff that's not really all that fun. One of those things is whether or not being an atheist means that you lack a belief or not. So in that same way, let me throw this out there, okay? If I have a brown paper sack in front of me, right, and I dump a whole bunch of ping pong balls inside of it, okay? I don't know how many there are. Maybe a dozen, maybe half a dozen, give or take. And I say, the number of balls in this bag, my bag of balls, Dallas, is positive. And you say, I don't believe you. And I say, why not? You say, because I haven't counted them. I don't have evidence to believe that. And I say, well, that means you think it's negative. You'd say, you're a dumbass, Robert. You know, like you'd be like, that I didn't say that just because I lack a belief that it's positive, that means that I am ascribing a belief that is negative. It's just that I don't believe it. I maybe it's true, but I don't know. And I know it's not really fun to do that, but unfortunately, you know, some philosophy stuff is necessary. I gotta tell you, man, I really hate reading John Stuart Mill, but I love his philosophy because once you get through On Liberty, you're like, oh my God, that guy's a goddamn genius. But he's like the worst fucking writer I've ever heard in my life. Like, why couldn't he write better? Nietzsche's fun to read, right? Nietzsche's the rock star. You read his stuff and you're like, whoa, should not have said that. Uh-oh. But Mill's boring as fuck. But we still got to do it. So that would kind of be my response is that, well, yeah, I totally get that you're like, dude, can we just have a conversation? And I agree with that 100%. But saying whether or not you have a positive or negative belief, it's not the funnest topic, but if we're going to have the convo, we got to dig in. We got to pay the Pied Piper, you know?
So, okay, my general thoughts on that is I think most atheists and I would want to try hard not to straw man anybody, but I feel like they're using that label of negative belief or lacking a belief to basically not claim a position. And in my view, it's really quite simple. It's really a binary choice. Either, at least in terms of like the question of belief, it's either I do believe in God or gods or what have you, or I don't believe in the existence of God or gods. Like that. It's really I think people want to complicate it more than it really is. And then my other comment in terms of like the gumball analogy or whatever it was, I think that's kind of what you were kind of like hinting at. I've heard that analogy numerous times, and I think while it's an interesting analogy, the reason why I don't like it as it applies to something like this is because something like that has no effect or relation on your general view of the world as a whole. Like it probably affects nothing else. While as whether you do or don't believe in God does have greater effects in terms of your worldview and the way you view things in the world, whether it be positive or negative. And I'm not going to get into whether that's positive or negative. I'm just saying that it has a much deeper effect. So I don't particularly like. While I understand the analogy, I don't particularly like it as it relates to these types of conversations.
Yeah, it does come up pretty weak. I agree with you. I think the conversation would be a lot easier if we both just picked a side. You know? Right.
Like I said, let's keep it as simple as possible. I believe X and here's why. You believe X and here's why. I think if we can just keep it that simple, it'll keep both sides. It's easier to understand the other side too when you are able to break it down in terms of it's kind of more. Well, I don't want to say simplistic because that makes it sound like I'm just simplistic. I'm just a dummy.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think we can find common ground here because I would say that if you're going to demand the atheist to make a stand, then you at least have to define what it is we're arguing about. So if you say the God of the Christian Bible, and then that person then can say whether or not they believe in that God, right? But the problem is if you just kind of say God like that, well, throughout all of history, God has been pretty elusive as a term to define something. Is it a creator? Is it the Brahma? Is it the mystical ether? Is it the great juju of the sea? What is God?
Sure, yeah, but all conversations have to start somewhere. So that's obviously where it should start, and then obviously we can get into I'm talking about this God, and this is how I define God, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think at that point it's totally fair to require the other person to make a claim. I think that's fair. That's totally fair. But you must recognize that until you make the initial claim, the person rejecting it can't make a claim. I cannot prove a negative. Once you say, this is the God that I'm talking about, then I can address that concept. But if we just skip to that, if I just start saying there is no God, and I start saying, well, there's no God because hell doesn't exist, And any kind of God that's all powerful and all, omnibenevolent wouldn't send people to hell anyway. And you go, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm a Church of Latter-day Christ, man. I don't actually believe hell's hell. I go, oh, well, I was arguing about a different God, I guess. And like, yeah, you were. Like, that's the problem with the conversation. So I think it's necessary that it does start from a place of defining those terms. Once again, even though it's not fun, but you kind of got to do the homework first on it, Once that happens, though, yeah, I'm with you, man. Let's have a real convo about it. Let's talk about the fact that I don't believe it. That's why I'm an atheist.
Yeah, another thing I would clarify too is that there's a distinction between kind of an assertion of fact and a claim of belief, like or I'm claiming a fact or I'm claiming a belief. Like I think those are two. I think one holds the burden of proof in terms of like I'm telling you something that is true versus I'm telling you something that I just believe. Like I don't think one of those doesn't require a burden of proof because you're not claiming something. I mean, yeah, you're claiming to believe something is true. And again, some may argue that, okay, now you're getting into the kind of the semantics or whatever, which, yeah, I mean, sometimes, that's unavoidable. But there definitely is a distinction there because I don't claim for a fact that God exists. Now, if I did, that's when I have the burden of proof. At least that's how I kind of view the whole concept.
Right. You don't have to have one. You're agnostic. You do not require a burden of proof. Absolutely. And me as an agnostic atheist, neither do I. But
right. No, we agree on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. But you do need to provide a justification for your belief if you want it to be presentable.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I am totally okay with saying that I should justify my lack of belief. I'm totally comfortable with that. But as long as you define the terms, I can't start that conversation. I can't start from a lack of belief because I have a lack of belief about the next thing you're going to say. You know why? Because I don't know the next thing you're going to say. You got to say it first. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can explain why you have a lack of belief in X, and that's where your position comes from. I can explain why I have a certain belief in X, and
as long as you define X,
right?
And that's a positive statement because you're saying I believe this thing exists, right? So it's not a positive claim. Fair enough. You're agnostic, but that is a positive statement. You're saying I believe this, and here's why. And then if I reject it, I better do my homework too, right? But up until that moment, I just don't think that I could offer you anything.
Sure.
That was a lame way for us to end on that. We should think of something more positive. That was great though. This whole conversation's been nothing but two people that disagree finding agreement, and that's really cool. That's really cool, man. I'm glad we talked today.
Yeah, I think the world definitely needs more of that.
Needs more of this shit.
Yeah, there's just way too many 100%. People just yelling at each other, calling each other names.
Yeah. I thought this conversation was going to be a little bit more controversial, just because we have a lot of differences. But that's the point, man. Two people got to talk, and we gotta sort all this shit out. That's the only way we're going to make it through.
Post show.
All right, man. Thanks so much, dude.
All righty.
This is the Right to Reason podcast.